the first thing I want to talk about, one of the concerns that we've heard from residents about the Embrace Millcreek plan is that, well, you're not talking about police service, you're not talking about fire and EMS, and these are crucial township services, and we do recognize those are crucial township services. So I wanted to quickly explain that we actually do have two other documents, two other planning initiatives that tie into Embrace Millcreek that do cover those services. The first is our Early Intervention Program report, which was a report that we had commissioned by the state earlier this year. And that report handled about three primary focus areas in township government. The first was a financial analysis. They looked at past revenues and expenditures and did future revenues and expenditure projections. They also looked at our administrative policies and procedures to try and identify efficiencies we might be able to make in our government operations. And they did a complete police department operational evaluation. So all those functions of township government, while you're not going to see them in the formal Embrace Millcreek comprehensive plan, they are part of the EIP, which is a companion document to the plan. The other elements of township government is the comprehensive plan, which is what Embrace Millcreek will be, which really is it's focused on establishing community goals and objectives for our township. And those are primarily related to developing strategies for development of the township and infrastructure maintenance. So that's what really, when we get into the presentation later, that's what this evening is going to be primarily about. And last is our Fire and Emergency Medical Services Master Plan. That was completed back in 2006. Some of the things that came out of that plan were the local services tax that was collected to help our volunteer fire departments. Another thing that came out of that was the part-time staffing arrangements at Westridge Fire Department. And one of the reasons that, and with that plan, it has sort of stalled from implementation, and a big reason for that is, and I think most of you probably realize this, is Millcreek Township doesn't have a formal governmental fire department. We have 5 volunteer organizations that support the township in terms of fire and EMS protection, along with Millcreek Paramedic Services, which are all independent organizations. So while this analysis of volunteer fire departments and MPS operations is important, what we've been trying to do, rather than do it in-house in the township for them, is to enable our fire departments and MPS to plan for themselves. Part of that was last year we did form the Fire and EMS Commission to really create a formal method for those 5 independent fire departments and MPS to coordinate, to plan jointly for capital expenditures, to plan jointly for operational procedures. And what we tasked that commission to do was to actually review and update that Fire Emergency Medical Services Master Plan. So we are not ignoring the needs of fire and EMS services in the township, but we are partnering with our volunteer organizations to have that analysis done by the folks who are actually providing the service, rather than having the township try and tell them what to do. So just want a quick overview of that. Every element of government services in the township is being analyzed, is being planned for, just not necessarily all in the same document. So what is Embrace Millcreek? Well, it is the Municipal Comprehensive Plan. And what that is it basically establishes a community vision for the township, identifies core principles and priorities, which is what we've been doing for the past 18 months, and also lays out an implementable development strategy, which is what we're laying out this evening for you folks to consider. And what we mean by implementable is things that we can actually do. You know, some of the challenges and other planning initiatives that you may have heard about in the region is, frankly, organizations may have planned for things they couldn't control, or planned for organizations they couldn't direct, or they planned for things they didn't have the staff capacity to actually implement, or they planned for things they didn't have the resources to implement. And that's why these plans tend to sit on shelves, as we have great ideas and great visions, but we don't have the groundwork in place to do the work of accomplishing those visions and goals and objectives. So when we talk about implementable, we want to make sure it's something that the Board of Supervisors can directly influence, making sure we have the staff capacity to perform, and if we don't, have an honest conversation about what that new staff capacity might be, and look at our resources for actually delivering on projects and services, and again, having an honest conversation with the public and what the costs of those new services and projects might be. Which goes to public engagement. Another part of Embrace Millcreek is having this dialogue. It's about improving communication with all of you and residents across Millcreek and partnering agencies, other organizations in the region, our neighboring municipalities. It's about enhancing transparency and accessibility, which is what we're doing right now with these studies, is really pulling back the curtain and showing where we're at, admitting some of the flaws we have in government, and also moving forward as a means to promote our community. So just want to show that's kind of what the Embrace Millcreek initiative is all about. A little bit of what we've been doing for the past year and a half. Last July, we had our neighborhood meetings. So we started off with a public meeting. In every corner of Millcreek, we did 4 what we called neighborhood meetings, one in Kearsarge, one in Bell Valley, one in the Westridge area, one in Westlake area, to have conversations so that we knew what the residents wanted us to look at before we started planning and performing our analysis. Phase 2, which was completed back in March, after we had taken input from the public through a public survey and through those meetings, and our team did some really deep dive analysis of some of the issues in the township that they'll get into later. We came back out to the public back in March with 2 community sessions, one on the west side, one on the east side, to talk about some of the concepts that we were considering for the plan. And we actually got really good feedback. I got to admit, our neighborhood sessions, very vocal concerns from residents for us to consider that we took very seriously and amended kind of our approach accordingly. And then back in March when we came back out, we were in this room with some of those concepts. Several residents actually came up to us and said, you know what, you really listened to us last summer because everything I talked about is captured in some of these ideas. So it was really encouraging. I think we're on the right track. And here we are in phase 3. Today we posted the plan on embracemillcreek.com. So if you have your smartphones, feel free to look at the whole plan. It's embracemillcreek.com. This is a presentation for all of you to kind of get an idea of how the plan came together, what we were thinking when we developed it. And I want you all to understand that this is not the end of the process at all. We're going to have the plan available online for you to read and digest and provide comments on for the next 30 days. And we really do want to have that continued dialogue with you all and with other organizations and residents to make sure there's buy-in for this thing before we begin the formal adoption process in July. So real quick, the EIP report that I mentioned earlier that had the financial projections for the township did not paint a rosy picture. We presented that to the public at our supervisors meeting, I want to say about 6 weeks ago. We didn't get much coverage on it. Reached out to the media a few weeks ago to try and get a little additional coverage to try and have this honest conversation with residents about where we're at as a township. And probably one of the most startling things that came out to residents was the fact that we are looking at sustained operational deficits of the township for the next 5 years. Significant deficits of about $4 million. And on Tuesday, we had a resident come to our supervisors meeting, and in a public comment, he made a really good point. And he came up to the podium, and in one hand, he had the Times News article from Sunday about the EIP, and the other hand, he had the Times News article from Monday about this meeting. And he said, how is it you guys can tell us you're going broke, and you want to try and do these great, special, big things? How can you do that? And I'd like to try and explain it to you, if you don't mind. Because this is a real challenge. And it's something we actually do have to face as a township. So, when you look at those revenue projections, they're flatlined. Basically, that's the result of a township that's pretty much been built out. We haven't seen much population growth. We haven't seen new development. So resting on our laurels that things will just happen here and we'll have an increased tax base, those days are pretty much over. So our primary sources of revenue as a township, about 75% of our operating budget comes from property taxes, just shy of 50% of our operating budget, and earned income tax, just shy of 25% of our operating budget. Now the EIP revenue projections, and that's based on current conditions, shows very small natural increases in the value of property, about 0.8%, and very small inflationary increases of household income, about 1.7%. That's where our flatlined revenues come from. Now, that doesn't sound good, but things could actually get worse. Our Embrace Millcreek projections have shown an increase in residential and commercial disinvestment. So we've seen creeping blight come into our township. We've seen stagnant population growth. And we've also seen a shrinking percentage of income earners. We have a graying population of more seniors and less workers. Now, I think here's the challenge we have to face, folks. The natural reaction when you hear, oh, there's deficits and we don't have enough money to do the core services is, well, let's constrict. Let's not do anything more. Let's not do anything different. Let's keep our heads in the sand. And that's not the way to move forward. So we have choices. And we've got a pretty basic choice, and that is do nothing, okay? And that's what I have to say in my brief time in Millcreek Township, past boards have tended to do. We'll just keep resting on our laurels, we'll just keep moving forward, keep our head in the sand, and what we can do if we do nothing is we can cover budget shortfalls with our reserves, about $8 million, that'll last us 2 years, and then we can cover our shortfalls with the water proceeds that we got from the sale of the Water Authority assets a few years ago, and that'll cover another 4 years. So our option is do nothing, balance with those reserves we have, and deal with a possible $20 million deficit in 6 years from now. It's a very easy political decision to make. Slightly harder is to raise property taxes. That means status quo on services and expenditures. It means we don't take a hard look at our spending. We don't take a hard look at what services that we might be able to discontinue in the township for savings. It means not taking a hard stand on our labor contracts and being very employee friendly in the building. I can tell you our labor costs have increased at 4 times the rate of inflation in the past 5 years. Real income of Millcreek residences have actually decreased, adjusted for inflation, but wages and benefits in the township have increased at 4 times that rate. And we as a board might want to start taking a look at that. We've tried in the past year, since I got into office, we have negotiated a new contract with our ASME union. We just announced that this morning. And I want to say we really do appreciate our ASME union. Took a very selfless vote yesterday to reduce their annual wage increases by 1/3, to increase their healthcare contributions by almost double, and to establish a new pay grade for new employees. So we have worked with our labor force, and we appreciate their efforts to really show their commitment to this township, to do what's best for the township, best for the taxpayers. And that'll help out a little bit. We're projecting that our projected cost increases will probably reduce by about $1 million over the next 5 years, thanks to our ASME labor union working with us on that contract. But even with that, if we don't actually take a hard look on other expenditures, you're looking at a 30% tax increase to cover those deficits. Now, the third choice we have is to start doing things differently. And this is where we need you to tell us to do things differently, to challenge the Board of Supervisors, to make hard choices, to take these reports that we've gotten in the past few weeks seriously and start acting on them. The first is implementing recommendations of the EIP to improve efficiency in township services and eliminate redundant services and put controls in place for cost escalations. Another thing we need to do, and I can tell you the EIP and the Embrace Millcreek plan reference each other frequently, is to implement the recommendations they're going to hear tonight on how we can start doing things differently in the township to help maintain current property values, to increase development in the township, and to attract new residences and businesses to actually grow the tax base. You know, I don't mean to be overly critical of our neighbor, but we had about 12 years of our neighboring municipality only focus on core services, and it really just managed the decline of their community. So we do need to strategically invest in our township to attract new residents, to attract new businesses, and to maintain what we have. And the third thing is both the EIP consultants and our Embrace Millcreek consultants are recommending that we actually establish new revenue sources that are more equitable. And I can tell you one of the big examples of that we've been talking about possibly is a stormwater management fee, which would actually be a fee that's placed on all parcels in the township, tax exempt or not, nonprofits. Everyone pays it as an equal share. And we've done some projections we'll talk about a little later about what that looks like compared to a property tax increase. So I just wanted to get ahead of that, let you all know that the EIP that was reported on Sunday is not in a vacuum from Embrace Millcreek. We recognize that there's challenges. We recognize that we can be doing things better, and that really, if nothing else, I hope you walk away from this meeting with a mentality that shrinking and ignoring and pulling back and doing less is not the solution for addressing some of these red flags that we see on the horizon.
All right, thanks for being here tonight, everyone, and thanks, John, for his preface to this presentation here. What I'll do over the next few minutes here is basically provide you with a preview of the structure of the plan that is now public, that's online. As John said, at embracemillcreek.com, there will be hard copies available for those who would prefer to look at a hard copy. Those will be available at the township offices for your review. So the document, it's about 70 pages long, this draft that's been released today. What you'll see in this document is a fairly simple structure. We walk through some trends that are shaping the Mill Creek community right now, have been shaping it for the last few decades. We talk about some core values and planning principles that have arisen from the surveys, from the neighborhood meetings, from the open houses that were held earlier this year. Then we walk through some specific focus areas, and the handout you have in front of you is organized in part by these 5 focus areas that we'll walk you through in this presentation here, talking about specific projects and recommendations around each of those focus areas. And what you have in front of you right now is the action plan. It's the final section of the plan that pulls together the various projects and recommendations into a very specific matrix that explains what you're doing, who's doing it, who's responsible for it, how you might pay for it, and when it will be done. As John said, implementability is the focus of this plan here, not something pie in the sky that sounds good, but you can't really get much traction on. This is about identifying things that can be accomplished in Mill Creek in the near and midterm. The first part of the plan are the trends, the trends and conditions that are shaping Mill Creek right now, and those trends in the plan are set up in a way that basically recognizes that Mill Creek approaches the future from a position of real strength and stability in many respects. There are many communities in this region, outside of this region, that would envy some of the assets, some of the demographic attributes that Mill Creek has to work with right now. Mill Creek has a lot to work with, and that's something that is recognized in the plan. But it's also recognized that there are many forces at work. John outlined a few of them just a minute ago, some forces that will undermine Mill Creek over time if they're not dealt with seriously over the next few years. And so here are, first of all, a quick run through of some of the strengths that Mill Creek is working with, some of the things that you can really build around. One thing is that the population in Mill Creek is a highly educated population, and becoming more so. You're more educated than the national average, than the state average, than the rest of Erie County. By 2020, 40% of adults in Mill Creek will have a college degree. That's important from a workforce standpoint. It's important from the standpoint that college-educated Mill Creek residents make 50% more than residents who just have a high school diploma. So those are monies for home improvement investments, home purchase investments, to spend at restaurants, services, and so on. So having a relatively high educational attainment level is a good thing for Mill Creek's economy, its property values, and so on. It also speaks to the fact that Mill Creek today, and for quite a while, has been a community of choice in Erie County. Today, 1 out of 5 families in Erie County live here in Mill Creek Township. But if you look at families making various levels of income, you actually have a higher share of families that make fairly good income. So you have 1 in 5 of all families in Erie County. If you look at families making more than $100,000, it's 1 in 3 of those families in Erie County have chosen to live in Millcreek. They could live almost anywhere in Erie County. They choose Millcreek. They've chosen it for a reason. Recent growth in some younger age groups. This is another building point here. So you have, since 2010, an upward trend in the number of millennials who are living in Millcreek Township. Since 2000, really, and 2005, 2010, you've seen an upward tick in folks who are in their 30s to 40s, folks who are starting young families, raising young families. Again, these are folks who are choosing Millcreek for some good reasons. An enviable collection of assets. Obviously, you have Presque, a major asset in the state of Pennsylvania. You have a great school district. You have LECOM. You have a number of assets that really provide a quality of life here that's remarkable. But you do have these other trends that are, again, working, that have the potential, if they're not already working against Millcreek, to undermine the township over the coming decade. One thing is that the population is aging. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I'll explain in just a moment, but it certainly is happening. The share of adults who are 25 to 44 years old as a proportion of all adults in the township has been shrinking since 2000, and the proportion of older adults in the township has becoming a more pronounced part. So again, aging population, not necessarily a bad thing. Where it comes to impact a township, it comes in a few different ways. One, as John mentioned, the income base in Millcreek Township is shrinking right now. If you add up all of the incomes of all of the households in the township, you look back at 2000 and as recently as 2015, 2016, that's a number that has been somewhere between $1.6 and $1.8 billion when you add up all household incomes. Because many households are shifting from their prime earning years into retirement now, total income, if you add all those up, it's actually beginning to fall. And again, that has implications on investments in the housing stock, on spending at restaurant services, and so on. So there are a few dilemmas that we point out in the report that are really posed by an aging population here in Millcreek Township, but also in a lot of communities in the country right now. So Millcreek has been a top choice for young families and other types of families in the region for a long time. As the resident base gets older, will retired residents have as much of an appetite to invest in things like schools and parks, in the things that attract young families, as they did when they were younger and had young families themselves? So that's one question we pose in the plan. A second question is related to housing. You see this across the country. It's well documented that as households reach and continue on into the retirement years, investment in a home begins to drop off a little bit. You have fixed incomes, just a different attitude in many cases towards the housing stock. And so will you enter a situation where many houses that are owned by older households see limited investment for the next 10, 15, 20 years? And if that happens, what will the marketability of those homes be in 2025, 2030? Will there be good buyers available at the time who will see those houses and say, that's a good deal, that's a nice house, I want to buy that, I want to buy into Millcreek? Oversupply of retail space. This has been something that we've paid attention to during this project because of the tumult in the retail sector that I'm sure all of you have been paying attention to over the last few years. Things that have been affecting the Millcreek Mall, most recently the closing of the Bonton. And there is an oversupply of retail space in Millcreek Township. Nationally, you have 24 square feet of retail per person. In Millcreek, you have 88 square feet per person. A lot of that is because you happen to have a major regional shopping hub here, so you would expect it to be pretty high. But even if you exclude the Peach Street, Mill Creek Mall area from an analysis, you still have quite a bit more retail space per person than the national average. So as that sector begins or continues to have a tumultuous, probably the next 5 or 10 years, what will that mean about potentially underutilized retail spaces, disinvestment along the major corridors of Mill Creek? And then ability to compete for households may be diminishing. The position that Mill Creek was in 30, 40, 50 years ago, where you had the newest school buildings, the newest roads, the newest parks, some of the newest housing, those are attributes that some of your neighboring municipalities now have, and you don't have those attributes anymore. You have older infrastructure that you're maintaining, an older housing stock, a bunch of legacy costs that younger municipalities, places that have grown more recently, don't necessarily have. So your ability to compete for some households who didn't think twice about Mill Creek 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And so as we wrap up the trends part of the plan, we basically put this bottom line in front of the reader, and John pretty much paraphrased this in his presentation. You have the potential to be a very strong, stable community, and you have many strong attributes today. But this is no time for coasting. That the next few years, the next 5 or 10 years, the investments you make, the way that you set yourself up to compete for households and businesses will really dictate how strong you are, what position you're in to decide your own future in 10 and 20 years. So that's an overview of the trends. The next part of the document that, again, has been just put on embracemillcreek.com this afternoon talks about core values and planning principles to guide decision-making. As John said, a comprehensive plan is about identifying and pursuing a vision for the community. And the core values that are identified in this draft plan pull from things that were heard during the neighborhood meetings, that came from the surveys, and that came from a bunch of stakeholder conversations that we've been having with township staff and others. And so the core values that are presented in the plan, they're pretty straightforward. And basically it's Mill Creek is committed to staying and becoming more family-friendly, committed to staying and becoming ever more fiscally prudent, recognizing that prudent doesn't just mean cheap. Prudent means making smart investments when you have to. Committed to ensuring that Mill Creek becomes a unique place. A lot of people have been talking about the need to create a stronger identity, that's something that Mill Creek is lacking a bit. And to be more competitive, you have to have a sense of uniqueness and a sense of identity, a stronger sense of identity. And then being committed to working together, both factions and stakeholders within Mill Creek, but also within the region. So these are our 4 core values that really do form the building block of a vision for the future of Mill Creek that is family-centered, fiscally prudent, about building and cultivating a strong identity because you have great assets to build from, and doing it by working together. And then there are some supplemental planning principles that pull from those core values that are very much in line with those core values. So basically, as you encounter decisions that you can either predict that you'll have to make, or as things come along in the next 5 or 10 years that you can't predict now, but decisions will have to be made, and you'll have to have a basis for making those decisions. That's what these principles are for. There's sort of a filter for making decisions in a consistent manner. So one principle is investing for the long term with an eye on excellence, impact, and sustainability. So again, not choosing to be cheap and fixing problems at sort of a scattershot fashion, but making sure that you're investing with an eye in sustainability and excellence. Promoting strong neighborhoods, making sure that any decision you're making isn't threatening the strength and desirability of your housing stock and your neighborhoods. Adapting to stay ahead, making sure that when you have an opportunity to do something differently and you're thinking about not doing it, understanding, well, why are you Why are you not trying to do something differently? What are the reasons for that? And is there a reason to try something new rather than relying on business as usual? So making sure that when you have an opportunity to do something new, that you put a lot of thought into it and try to seize that. Celebrating and asserting what makes Millcreek unique. So making sure that you're not threatening your major assets, and that when you have a chance to cultivate and accentuate them, like Presque, for example, that you're doing everything you can to make them as special as possible so that you're more competitive, can compete more for households and businesses. And then making sure that you do collaborate as you undertake projects, thinking who isn't at the table who should be at the table, who isn't at the table who could make this a better project if we draw them in and structure this project in a more collaborative way. So again, none of these are stunning, unusual statements here. These are pretty simple and basic. And again, they're supposed to serve as a filter for just thinking. As you make big decisions or small decisions, are we collaborating? Are we thinking about the long term? That's the function of that part of the plan. The bulk of the plan that you'll see is grouped around these 5 focus areas, and that's a major part of the structure of the action plan that you have in front of you tonight. So 5 focus areas that were identified fairly early on in the plan from an original survey that was done, an online survey that was done towards the beginning of the project, and that was sort of refined during the process of the neighborhood meetings last summer. So creating a distinctive and high-quality gateway district to Presque, strengthening neighborhood investment within the township, positioning commercial corridors, 8th, 12th, 26, Peach Street, Peninsula Drive, positioning them to adapt and redevelop over time, supporting business development in the township, and promoting strong and sustainable stewardship of township infrastructure, things like roads, things like stormwater maintenance systems. And so with that, we'll just walk through right now in summary fashion these 5 focus areas so you get a sense of the recommendations and projects that you'll find when you review the document.
These 5 focus areas were identified pretty early on, and what we want to do is to just take a couple of minutes to walk through each one. So each of us will have 5 or so slides to walk through these and kind of give you an outline of this. So the first one is to create a distinctive and high-quality gateway district for Presque. Certainly, without a doubt, Presque is an extraordinary community asset. With 13 beaches, 21 miles of trails, 4 million visitors, it infuses about $71 million into the local economy with visitors, expenditures, et cetera. And so one of the first things that the steering committee and the community pointed out was that there's not a sense of cohesiveness around this area. So the idea was to start to create this district, to start to brand this district, and to do it in a phased approach. So phase 1 would be the creation of a detailed area plan. Phase 2 would be the partnering with local and state and private entities to actually get this implemented. And 3, as we look long term, is to start to look at what the opportunities are to move this area slightly eastward toward Pittsburgh Avenue. And I'll show you the next slide, is the area that we've identified. Right now, it's roughly Summerheim Avenue on the east, Wyoming on the west, and down toward Haas or 10th Avenue, if you assume that right-of-way went all the way across, and up to the lakefront. Certainly this includes Scott Park, it includes the Tom Ridge Environmental Center, it includes the Waldemere Park, 8th Street Commercial District, the Colony, and I mentioned Scott Park. We also think that that's an important component of this. The goal here in the phasing of this would be to focus up front on streetscape opportunities in and around 8th Street Commercial District as a heart of this district, to begin to focus our energies there, whether that's streetscape improvements, recommendations for mixed-use zoning, recommendations for design guidelines or design standards, and potential public investments, sidewalks, streetscape, lighting, street lighting, et cetera. Our hope would be that our recommendation would be that you begin with 8th Street. But there's another corridor that connects to the actual entry to Presque, and that is the area along Peninsula Drive between 8th Street and the entryway. This was prepared by PennDOT I think this was done in March of this year actually, and it's a recommendation illustrating multimodal opportunities for pedestrians and bicycles. As the detailed area plan gets underway for this, it's strongly recommended that the community look at this and pick a desired solution. There's a series of alternatives that are recommended by PennDOT, and I think that needs to be honed down. Those solutions need to be identified and implemented simultaneously to the work on 8th Street. Oops. 8th Street, as I mentioned earlier, has the capacity for tremendous streetscape improvements. As you look at the image on the left, that's the existing configuration for 8th Street right now. The one on the right would be a phased recommendation. So the existing situation is that cars can egress in this case, the Colony Plaza, anywhere. There are no defined curb cuts. There's not a sense of streetscape in terms of vertical elements on either side. Could that be improved with the implementation of street trees and street lighting and new sidewalks to create a more walkable environment? And then eventually, could we begin to frame the corner? This is Lowell and 8th Street. Could we begin to frame that corner and start to create a very identifiable and branded commercial district? Oops, I keep going backwards. This is a potential street section that illustrates buildings, in this case on the corner of Lowell and 8th Street, that could be moved forward, that could be built closer to the street to create that kind of Main Street environment. Again, you'll see the street trees. This one illustrates the potential for street parallel parking on either side. That creates a sense of safety as you're walking along the street. Again, the idea here is to create a definable commercial district, and that can be accomplished with public investment, the aesthetic improvements, as well as infrastructure improvements for pedestrian and bike activity as well.
So the neighborhood, strengthening neighborhood investment, the second focus area in the draft document. And here on this slide here, we provide just an outline of the core recommendations. So first one is tailoring neighborhood interventions to market conditions. I think something that everyone recognizes is that not every street in Millcreek's neighborhoods are the same. You have some streets that are dominated by 1950s Cape Cod, some streets that are dominated by 1960s ranch homes, 1970s split levels. You have more recent subdivisions with higher end homes built since 2000. So you have a variety of residential market types scattered across the township, and the needs of different neighborhoods, of different blocks in the township will vary depending on what is happening there, what types of housing are there, who are the homeowners, what life stage are they in. You have a variety of market conditions, and so one of the core recommendations is to recognize that you need to tailor what you're trying to do in Millcreek's neighborhoods to the markets that you have. And so there are some tools in the plan that identify subdivisions by age and identify what the home values are there, what code violation concentrations you have there, that sort of lay out some key conditions and suggest what are the problems you're trying to solve on a street of 1950s Cape Cods versus maybe a cul-de-sac with homes built between 2000 and 2005. So that is one core part of the neighborhood section. And it's related to the next two because it recognizes that, as John said at the beginning, that in some neighborhoods you do have some blight issues that have become more pronounced in recent years. Something that came across loud and clear during the open houses earlier this year when we had some of this information presented on a poster was people coming by looking at a map of blight concentrations and nodding their heads and talking about their own street and some trends that they've been noticing in their neighborhoods. So a few things that are contained in the plan that recognize the need to limit the spread of blight where it has already become an apparent problem. One, coordinate housing rehab activities to turn around troubled properties. There's some tools in the plan for identifying where you have the largest concentrations of troubled properties, and we lay out some options. One option is simply the township serving a function of coordinating or connecting struggling home buyers who might not have the resources to keep up or to continue to maintain their home, connecting them with some good buyers who have a track record of turning around and fixing up houses, or connecting a struggling home buyer with some resources to make some needed code compliance repairs. Also, if you have some cases, some potentially very difficult cases of blighted properties that are in, tax foreclosure, bank foreclosure. There are some new tools out there, including the recently created Erie County Land Bank, where the Millcreek Township should consider that a significant partner when it comes to dealing with some significant blight issues, whether it's acquiring a house to tear it down if it's too far gone, or finding a way to rehab a house, put it back on the market, put it back in the hands of a homeowner. So there's some material laid out talking about the need to coordinate with partners to identify troubled properties and fix those problems before they undermine surrounding property values and dampen the confidence of homeowners who are doing the right thing. Expanding proactive code enforcement and compliance assistance is a related recommendation. Proactive code enforcement, basically, it recognizes that code enforcement isn't just about going around writing tickets. It's about helping neighbors understand why code enforcement is important. It's understanding through communication, talking with people, recognizing that some people aren't making the improvements because they're not sure how, they don't have the resources, and it's about trying to figure out some solutions, putting folks in touch with resources. Again, it's more about problem solving, finding some creative ways to solve problems than simply writing tickets. That is the direction that the township is already going in, and it's something that should be continued. And again, the plan does provide some tools for identifying parts of the township where proactive code enforcement can do the most good, because you have some moderate levels of blight now apparent. Modifying zoning to expand rental housing opportunities along major corridors. Rental housing has increased in supply in Millcreek Township since 2000. I'll have a slide that shows that in just a second. And so there is a demand for more rental housing in Millcreek. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, you have this retail sector that is overbuilt in many parts of the township. You will have a need over the next 10 to 20 years to identify, and private developers will have a need to identify some alternative uses for areas that used to be retail, that used to be other uses that are no longer as in demand. And so one idea is to modify zoning so that if there is a demand, if a private developer sees a need, that you can begin to develop some rental housing opportunities as part of mixed-use developments along some major corridors where there's good access to bus lines, good walkability to neighboring businesses, and so on. The last one here that I'll mention is preparing to act on emerging issues. Two emerging issues, and you might even say that they're here and now issues, are rental conditions. Because of the increased supply of rental housing since 2000, something that the township needs to pay serious attention to is the condition of rental housing and monitoring that situation to make sure that the rental housing stock is in good shape and that doesn't slip where it hasn't slipped yet. And also we recognize that mobile home parks are a major part of the housing stock in Millcreek Township, almost 1,000 units within a township with 16,000 housing units. And so those are areas where the township should be prepared over the next 10 or 15 years or so to think about some of these rehab activities, code enforcement, that those two items on this list here, you should be prepared to bring those to the forefront when it comes to dealing with mobile home conditions when they slip too far down. A few things that I'll point out here, tools that are in the plan or some useful data. One is this image right here, which shows concentrations of properties in the township that are in fair to poor condition, properties that we would say are slipping. This was data that was obtained last fall through a field survey that we conducted with some help of some students from Edinburgh University of every single residential structure in the township, rating every single structure on a very simple scale based on visual cues about levels of investment or disinvestment in that residential property. And over 300 properties were identified as having several red flags, whether it was, peeling paint, a roof that was well past its prime, overgrown landscaping, basically visual cues that said something is going on here that probably isn't good for this neighborhood. There's something wrong here that might need to be addressed soon before it causes damage to surrounding property values. And so this map here is basically a heat map that shows the relative concentration of those 300 some odd properties across the township. Obviously, as you can see here, where you see darker colors, that's where you have larger concentrations of slipping properties in close proximity. This is a useful tool that the township can use to identify some specific pockets where if you go in there to identify some troubled properties, bring together the right partnerships to find solutions for those properties, and do some proactive code enforcement that you could be able to keep blight in check where it's already beginning to crop up. On the rental issue, just a quick spotlight on some data that is in the plan. Total number of occupied housing units in Millcreek has gone up 6% since 2000. The total number of rental units in the township has gone up 22%. So that's where almost all of your growth in housing in Millcreek since 2000 has been. You've seen growth of almost 1,200 rental units since 2000. And I think an interesting trend that a lot of people, until we show them this number, I don't think they had really thought about that, but a lot of the uptick in rentals has been in the form of single-family homes that are being rented instead of owner-occupied. That's a figure that went from a little over 900 such properties in 2000 to almost, getting close to 1,500 today. So that jumped 56%. And so that's, again, speaks to I think, demand for rental housing, not just in Millcreek, but in this region, and something, it's a trend we've seen nationally over the last decade or so. And it also speaks to the need to pay attention to this. You have more rental housing. A lot of it is fine. A lot of it is in great shape. But over time, having the systems and programs in place to make sure that you monitor those conditions, that they stay in good shape, and that they don't become problems like they have in many communities.
One of the things that I think is kind of interesting about this plan is when Pete was talking about the trends and some of the things that Millcreek has been experiencing over the last decade or two, and things that could likely continue or happen in the future. Is these focus areas, as they've evolved from early on in the process, some of these things were identified through surveys and community participation that we had. Hopefully you're starting to see a link between why these focus areas are the way they are, some of the recommendations, and how they relate back to some of those trends that Pete talked about a few minutes ago. Position the corridors for adaptation and redevelopment is another focus area that we heard early on from folks about the commercial corridors looking a little bit tired. A lot of the building stock is older. The roadways in the public realm was primarily designed for strictly moving cars. And the way that we live today is a little bit different than the way that we lived back then when things were originally designed. And so as we move forward to accommodate a changing retail market, to accommodate some of the things that Pete was just talking about in terms of rental housing and market rate rental housing, there's some things in the plan that we want to make sure we get your feedback on that can really make a difference in changing these corridors, not only the way that they look and feel, but in terms of their flexibility to adapt to a changing commercial and retail market. So with my aging eyes, I have to move a little closer to be able to read this here, but make public realm improvements to enhance the image of the corridors and leverage private sector investment. As I mentioned gentleman a few minutes ago asked about bike lanes on the corridor. Almost every time that I've been in Millcreek, I see people walking and also biking on the commercial corridors, but yet there are no biking facilities or pedestrian facilities. So that's something that I think was brought up early on, and kind of through our own observation of getting to know Millcreek, we could see it firsthand. So making those public realm improvements not only will try to begin to accommodate other users like bicyclists as well as pedestrians, but also enhance the image of the corridors. On some of these corridors, you take 26th Street, you're looking at 30,000 cars a day. Those 30,000 cars a day aren't all Millcreek residents. They're people from the region, they're people visiting Millcreek, passing through, and the image that you send to them based on what they see traveling through these corridors is very powerful. So as these corridors begin to change, it's important to show that we're investing in these corridors. So when some of these corridors are redeveloped or repaved, to look at opportunities. Are there opportunities to get bike lanes in? Are there opportunities to put sidewalks in and possibly street trees and those types of things? So public realm improvements is not just necessarily streetscape improvements, but also those pedestrian and bicycle improvements as well. Another recommendation in the plan is update the zoning and land development codes to provide land use flexibility, ensure quality design, and bring certainty to the development review process. There's several things going on in there. In terms of the code to provide land use flexibility, right now the commercial codes are primarily zoned for single type uses. So if it's a commercial zone, you can pretty much do commercial uses in there. One of the things that's in the plan, one of the tools, is to provide some flexibility as the retail market and the commercial market continue to change and developers or property owners look for other opportunities for their property. Mixed use zoning is certainly an option. We talk about that in the plan. It provides a lot of benefits. One, it enables other uses that are compatible to be within close proximity to one another. They can share parking. It helps to reduce infrastructure costs because you're not spreading things out. It can actually help in terms of placemaking. You can walk between uses, all of those types of things. Another piece of that is the quality design. When people talked about the image of these corridors and the image that you're sending to those 30,000 cars a day, quality design is more than just the public realm. It's also the private realm, or the relationship or the interface between what happens on the private side, and that's what zoning typically addresses, and then what happens on the public side, which is within the right-of-way. How that interface is treated is very important. It sends that message, and what those users of the corridors actually see and feel, and make a determination or a first impression of what Millcreek is all about. So bring in some design standards and guidelines into the mix that will help with location of parking, the orientation of the buildings, those types of things, and then providing some flexibility from a land use standpoint is going to be important. And then the last part of that is bringing certainty to the development review process. When you hear a developer say time is money, there's truth to that. And certainty not only brings, sends a message to the potential developer or property owner that what is expected and the things that they need to go through, and if they do those things that are in the code, that they can be assured that they will move through the development review process. But it brings certainty to the municipality and the town staff to understand how the process is going to work, and then there's an expectation of what the development is actually going to bring, how it's going to look, how it's going to function. But then also it brings certainty to adjacent property owners and the other residents of Millcreek to know that someone that might be down the road that owns a similar property is going to be held to the same standard that you were held to. And it brings a little bit of more certainty to that investment by both the property owner and adjacent landowners. This is a typical street view. I think it's Peninsula Drive looking north. As you can see, this is pretty typical of many of the commercial corridors, whether it be 26th or 12th or 8th. 8th Street is a little bit more compact, but you can see there's no pedestrian accommodations, there's no street edge, you don't really have any street trees, you don't accommodate bicyclists, and it's just starting to look a little bit tired from what people have been saying from the very beginning of the process. This is another tool that I touched briefly on in terms of mixed-use development. A lot of times when people think of mixed-use development, they think of only the vertical mixed use. They think of Main Street, where you might have a first-floor commercial retail use with an upper floors that might be residential or office uses. But we also have mixed use that is horizontal. You can have an office building in close proximity to a multifamily. You can have a commercial building that might be in close proximity to a residential multifamily rental units. And this could happen on the same site sometimes, or it can happen on different parcels that might be in close proximity to one another. So when we talk about mixed-use development in the plan, we are talking about both vertical and horizontal mixing of uses in terms of providing that flexibility. We talked about design standards and guidelines and bringing certainty to the development review process. This is just an example of using graphics to illustrate and to articulate concepts and ideas from a zoning and land development standpoint, where this is a typical strip multi-building development where you might have some anchor buildings back there. These buildings right now either don't exist in strip plaza development, or they're typically surrounded by parking. So you might have the Verizon or some of those out parcels, but there's no pedestrian accommodations. If you wanted to actually walk there from the street, you wouldn't be able to do that. So there's things that you can actually put in the development review process and the zoning code to actually require some of these things to happen in concert with what's happening on the public realm as well. So I think that's my last slide. I'll turn it back over to Pete to talk about support business development. I believe this might be our last focus area.
Okay, support business development is a fairly simple section that has the following recommendations. One is embracing a leadership role, that Millcreek embrace a leadership role in the development of regional economic strategy. Millcreek is the second largest population hub in the county. It's the second largest jobs hub. It's the biggest retail hub. So it should take on a leadership role with other municipalities, with regional organizations, to set an agenda for regional economic development and to clarify what role Millcreek can play and can contribute to a stronger regional economy. The entire region's population, Erie County's population, has been pretty stagnant for the last 30 to 40 years. And so if part of what Millcreek is trying to position for itself over the next few decades is to compete for households and businesses, that's, that if the region isn't growing, you're playing musical chairs within Erie County. And so if Millcreek can not only make sure that it is competitive for households and businesses within the region, but can be part of a process of elevating the competitiveness of Erie County, that would be ideal. Millcreek is well positioned to play a role like that. Developing a proactive business outreach program, recognizing that you have over 1,300 firms in Millcreek that have payrolls. You have a lot of businesses, and there needs to be a process over the next few years for the township to do more outreach to those businesses, to learn what their needs are, what opportunities do they see for the township to realize, what can they do, what can the township do to make the life of businesses easier. What types of investments do businesses think the township should be making in itself? So that's a recommendation there, to begin a process of boosting outreach so that more input is obtained from businesses in township investments and township operations. The last item is supporting adaptive reuse of marginal industrial and commercial properties, which connects right with what Matt said about the commercial corridors when it comes to doing things that allow greater flexibility. If you have a lot of properties that were built for one use and that use isn't in as much demand anymore, and you have properties that need to transition to other uses and developers who would like to transition those properties, make sure you have policies in place that allows that to happen within reason and that helps to facilitate the transition of properties from a former use to a newer use that can be beneficial to the economy, to the tax base, and to residents in Millcreek. And just you have some examples in Mill Creek already of adaptive reuse taking place, of an old Walmart on West Ridge Road that's now home to several office users. You have the old former the 84 lumber property nearby that's now used as a sports facility. These are good examples of taking properties that might otherwise, if they had remained retail properties, they might still be vacant today. But you have some very talented developers in the region who have the wherewithal to make these transitions and to find opportunities to reactivate these spaces, put them back on the tax rolls, and make them centers of activity for the township. So you have a history of this already in the township, and with some recommendations that we have in the plan for zoning and land use development codes, we think that will only support further development like that in the future. And now for the final focus area on promoting strong and sustainable stewardship of township infrastructure.
Everyone still awake? This is the exciting stuff. This is the good stuff here. Okay, so typically when we're talking about comprehensive plans, you don't usually put like infrastructure maintenance in there. You just don't. It's usually kind of pretty pictures and high ideals. And one of the things that came out of our neighborhood meetings last summer was a very vocal call to action of the supervisors to focus on infrastructure. So that's why we have this whole focus area primarily on roadway maintenance and stormwater management issues, and also references to our parks and recreation development. So some of the things that we've acknowledged in the plan is that there really has not been a systematic capital program for our infrastructure maintenance. There really hasn't. I think I look around the room, I'm sure a lot of you have called the supervisor and said, I want to talk to a roadmaster, my road needs paved. My road hasn't been paved in a long time, come pave my road, and a roadmaster gets our crews together and goes and paves the road based on new complaints. Basically, political paving is the term that I heard when I first took office. And that's not how a mature, really urban community like ours should be operating. One of the first things that we did about a year and a half ago is I got rid of the old roadmaster titles so that we actually utilize our director of public works and our bureau chief of streets and our engineers for prioritizing roadways instead of the guys who win the popularity contests. So that's one of the focus areas of this plan is how do we improve roadway maintenance. Another issue is our stormwater maintenance, storm sewers, and there's really two primary issues when it comes to storm sewers. It's or stormwater. It's flooding issues, which is what most of us are concerned about. And then there's also regulatory issues from DEP and about pollutants in our streams, and we have a lot of regulations that we have to comply with that Mr. Waldinger is going to speak to in a moment. So with that, roadways. One of the things we instituted about 2 years ago in the township is a systematic approach of monitoring our roadways. And what we did is we instituted best practices from Federal Highways and PennDOT to actually evaluate all of our roadways and then score them from a rating of 0 to 5. Now, I could go through rutting and cracking and potholes and pushing and shoving, but real quick, basically a 0 means it's almost a brand new road with no visible signs of wear or tear. A 1 is you're going to see maybe the paint is getting wearing off, you'll see some slight cracking. A 2 is when you're going to call me and say, hey, there's a pothole, come fix it, and we'll come fix the pothole. A 3 is when you're going to call me and say, when are you going to pave this road? That's when you're going to start seeing a series of potholes, more severe cracking. A 4 is when you're going to call me and say, my road hasn't been paved in 20 years, right? Where essentially there are long stretches of potholes. You probably have to drive more slowly to navigate the roadway. And the 5th is when you call me and tell me you're going to send me a repair bill for your vehicle. So that's really, in layman terms, what that scoring means. And what we've looked at it, as you can see, we've got only about a third of our roadways are at a 0 rating, which means really good, very smooth. And then we've got about another 20% that are in that 3, 4, 5 really need repaving done. So when we're talking about asset management and planning, we have to have realistic expectations of what we can afford to produce for the public, what level of service is a reasonable expectation. So when we're looking at things like zeros and ones and twos, those are roadways that they're going to require some crack sealing, they're going to require a pothole crew once in a while. But overall, that road is not going to be in such a poor condition that it's going to hinder travel, or it's going to endanger anyone. It's a roadway that is in pretty good condition that that needs some potholes or crack sealing. But when you get to 3s, 4s, and 5s, those are the priorities we're looking at in this plan that we do need to reduce. We do need to make sure we're getting ahead. And there's been a lot of deferred maintenance in the township. There's been a lot of corners being cut. I'm sure a lot of you have seen what we call a scratch coat, where we just kind of smear good asphalt on top of bad. In the past 2 years, we've changed that. We don't do that anymore. Everything is milled out and repaved. We just announced today paving bids for private contractors to help supplement our workforce. So we're getting about 11 miles of roadway paved this year. And we also have been utilizing state resources. We just got awarded a grant from the state for $200,000 so we can pave our stretch of Cherry Street. So we are looking at other ways of financing roadway maintenance, and we are improving our strategies of how we prioritize roadways. So moving forward in the plan, what we're looking at is three different projections for what we can do in the next 10 years when it comes to roadway maintenance. Now, again, you can see the 21% needs improvement, 78% is generally acceptable. Projecting out, and we for the first time, we've actually done an analysis of kind of roadway degradation and what expected deterioration cycles will be for these roadways. If we just keep on what we've been doing with this new method of prioritizing and sticking to it without letting kind of politics get in the way of best practices and proper planning, we will see that reduced slightly, but in 10 years, with just what we were already doing with our regular budget allocations. You're going to see a 21.5% of bad roadways turn into about 17%, which is an improvement. But we have a feeling that that's not acceptable to the public. So we're looking at, okay, what if we wanted to reduce that by half? We go from 20% of our roads being improvement every year to let's get on maintenance cycles only 10%. Now, if we're doing that, that means we've got to pave about another 1.25 miles every year. And we talked about having an honest conversation of what that's going to cost. It's about $200,000 a mile to repave a roadway. That's labor and materials. Whether we contract it out, whether we use our own forces, that's going to be about the average number. So to do the extra 1.38 miles is going to cost about $276,000 more a year. And so we also, again, to have this honest conversation with folks of what that means is, how do we pay for that? The only way to pay for roads is to increase our capital improvement millage rate, or your property taxes. And to generate that, it's about a 2% tax increase. So rule of thumb, for every additional $4 that the average household in Millcreek pays in taxes, the township generates about an extra $100,000 in revenue, general rule. So for every $4 you pay, the townships give $100,000. And that, obviously, that would be a tax increase on everyone in the township, but that's what it comes out to for the average homeowner. So that gets us to 50% reduction in bad roads. Now, if the expectation is, and again, the phone calls, the expectation is no bad roads. What we're looking at, and we factored, how do we do that? How are we going to cycle that no road is ever worse than just needs some pothole patches? We would need to pave an additional 3 3/4 miles of roadway every year for the next 10 years. That's going to cost us another $745,000. And that is going to come out to, I believe, almost a 6% tax increase. So it's going to be about another, I apologize. About another $30 annually for our taxpayers. So Option one of increase, about $11 annually, you'd see increase to your property taxes. Option two is about $3 increase. So again, we just want to have, I'm not saying the township's going to raise taxes to do that. We just want to have an honest conversation with folks about what it costs to increase that level of service, and that's whether we do it with our own forces or contracting it out. So something for you guys to think about. Let us know how you feel about it in the comment sections that we have out for you. Send us emails, and it's a conversation we'll be having as a board of supervisors for how do we address those things. And with that, we'll move on to stormwater management, which Mr. Waldinger, our Director of Planning and Development, is going to go over.
Well, as John mentioned, at our public meetings, we heard two major infrastructure complaints. The first was the roads, and the second was stormwater management. Of those complaints, the majority of them were flooding, but we also saw a lot of infrastructure maintenance complaints. I would ask everybody here that has an orange barrel in their neighborhood to raise their hand, but I realize it's going to be a lot of you. The infrastructure maintenance part are those issues: deteriorating storm sewer, deteriorating grates. The flooding we all hear about, we had a lot of rain lately, a lot of high intensity rain. It's the capacity of the system to convey that water to the lake without backing up in the street or your yard, or hopefully not your home. I want to touch on the infrastructure maintenance a little bit because, like I mentioned with the orange barrels, that's something you can see. The concern with our maintaining our stormwater management system is that's just a tiny fraction of the system itself. The vast majority of that system is buried underground. It's pipes, some pipes that have been there 70, 80 years at this point. For the majority of the township that was developed out in the 80s, you're talking 40 years, and a lot of that is corrugated metal pipe. It rusts when the salt hits it in the winter. That accelerates the process. So as time goes on, the township will have more problems with stormwater infrastructure maintenance. The plan proposes a couple of solutions to that. The first one is doing a thorough inventory of our assets, and that will actually be very important to address both of these issues. We need to know where all of our pipe is. We have a pretty good general idea, but everything is disjointed. If you have a storm sewer on your street, we've got a map for your street. If there's a storm sewer 3 blocks over, that's on another map, possibly in another drawer. We don't have a comprehensive view of the entire system, how it works. We also don't know the condition of a lot of these pipes. So one of the suggestions here, this inventory would involve locating all of this system through geographic positioning systems, GPS, adding it into a system where we can keep track of our inventory, keep track of the age and the condition, and proactively act on some of these things before we have issues. Another thing that the plan is recommending is to do some open space planning, to find some of these areas where we have chronic flooding, and if possible, acquire some property in the area, whether it's unused, whether it's not being utilized because it floods and people don't want to operate their businesses there. If we can acquire some of that property, turn it back into green space, not only will that give us an area where we can store flooding and help people downstream, but also alleviate the issue that exists there. So what we'll talk about coming up here, John will mention some things, would be an accelerated stormwater program. Right now, as I said, there's a lot of those orange barrels, a lot of pipes that are failing, and the township, I can't even say at this time, is catching up. I think we get a little bit more behind every year. We'll fix some orange barrel, or some catch basins, remove those barrels, we'll move them to another spot, and we'll have to add more. So the first step would be $50,000. That would double the township's material budget and would get us a good way towards just keeping up, or just catching up, I'm sorry. Then the additional, or the second portion of that, the additional $50,000 would be to increase the township's emergency fund. Over the past several years, the township has realized that we don't know where it's going to happen, but at some point during a year, we're going to have one or more storm sewer failures. So we've started building an emergency fund into our budget to take care of those. And we find that even the amount that we predict is usually not enough to cover the issues that we have. So an additional $50,000 would add to that emergency fund and would allow us to keep them. And then we would need an additional $100,000 to address problem areas and to get ahead. So that's a total of $200,000 additional, and John will talk a little bit about how we could go about possibly funding that in the future. The second major area, and John mentioned it earlier, is some regulatory issues that we have regarding stormwater. Before I really start here, one thing the government's really good at is creating these really long, jargony titles and then using some acronyms to describe them so nobody knows what we're talking about. So underneath the picture over there, I have a couple of acronyms that I'm going to use during this discussion. First one is the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. That's the DEP. The next one is what's known as the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, or MS4. That is basically a designation that the township and many other municipalities in Erie County have that was given to us by DEP that indicates that we have a system that discharges stormwater to open bodies of water, in our case, creeks and then the Lake Erie. And then we have regulations that are placed on what we discharge on top of that. And then the last acronym that I'm going to speak about is what's known as a Pollutant Reduction Plan, or a PRP. And that is something that DEP is now requiring us to do as a condition of our MS4 permit. So you can see at the top there on the left, the DEP issues MS4 permits in 5-year cycles. So we're just beginning a brand new 5-year cycle. This has been going on for a little over a decade. This is the first cycle where DEP is requiring us to do these pollutant reduction plans. Up until this point, it's been mapping our system. We were responsible for testing it to make sure that we weren't letting known pollutants out. But now the DEP has actually come to the township and said, there are a certain number of impaired streams in your township. These are what they are, and you have to take active steps to prevent pollution. And in this case, in every stream in the township, the pollutant that they're concerned about is sediment. There are other areas of the state where that might be phosphorus, might be mine drainage, might be some other things, but we're lucky where we don't have any of those actual chemical pollutants, but the DEP does consider silt and sediment as a pollutant, and we're responsible for alleviating a portion of that. So our permit, our 5-year permit, we're required to create a pollutant reduction plan that removes 10% of our current load. So the amount of sediment that currently comes out of the streams in Millcreek, we have to reduce that amount by 10% over the next 5 years. We hired a consultant to study the whole township, to devise a plan, to come up with locations where we can do projects that will get us to that goal. And they've identified 4 stream restoration projects that will help us meet that goal and that we are going to be required to do over the next 5 years. Those are a portion of Scott Run between the Tom Ridge Environmental Center and the condominiums where there's severe erosion. That is Wilkins Run north of Westlake Road. West of Asbury, there's a very, very severe erosion problem there where a lot of sediment, we're actually going to get the majority of our credit for restoring that portion of the stream because a lot of sediment travels into Lake Erie from there. There's West 28th Street, which is an area of chronic flooding. It was an old creek that was previously enclosed by a developer. We're going to look at restoring that to a naturalized state, which will not only help some of the flooding in that area and alleviate some of the backup, but then also allow us to get credit for our MS4 permit. And then Bladen Park, which is off of Cherry Street Extension near Bladen Road. It's another area of severe erosion that the township actually is able to get in and do a project. The total cost of those 4 projects over the next 5 years is just shy of $900,000. That works out to $167,000 a year that the township is mandated to spend in order to fix this, in order to comply with our permit. And this is just for a single 5-year cycle. While there is no guidance yet for what the next 5-year cycle is, we assume that the township will be required to at least remove 10%, if not more, of our load at that time. So this is an ongoing regulatory requirement of the state that we have to comply with, and not only in the future will we have to construct these PRPs, but we will also be required to maintain the ones that we already have to ensure that they're functioning properly. So it will be an escalating cost over time. So right now I'm going to turn it back over to John, and he's going to talk about some.
All right, folks, I want to cover one more point, and then we're going to open up for Q&A. When we're talking about kind of other funding options for these sorts of things, the total, I think you all have your handout in front of you, and one of the things on the back page, it says kind of the operational costs if we're going to implement Embrace Millcreek. It ranges from about $840,000 to $1.4 million annually, and that big difference is really that jump between reducing the roadway paving problems from 50% to 100% better. But when we're talking about the stormwater management issues, that's where we have an opportunity for a more flexible and equitable revenue generation method. So right now, our stormwater maintenance and our roadway maintenance, it's pretty much all done by the same group of guys. It's our Streets Bureau. And the budget for our Streets Bureau, when you consider a capital budget and operating, is around $5 million is what we put towards that bureau. We've calculated that probably about 40% of their work could be justified as, or reassigned to focus on stormwater maintenance. And stormwater maintenance can now, thanks to recent regulatory actions by the state, can now be billed almost like a utility bill would be. So rather than paying for stormwater maintenance through raising property taxes, we could actually institute a stormwater management fee that every property owner in the township would pay. So I mentioned earlier that roundabout for every $100,000 of revenue the township raises through property taxes is about a $4 hit to homeowners. We had the county planning department help us develop kind of a rough cost estimate of what an impervious surface fee would be, which is how the most common way of billing for stormwater management fee is you calculate how much impervious surface you have in your township through GIS mapping, calculate what the average impervious surface is per homeowner, and then you use that kind of a rate to establish a fee to pay for your stormwater management activities. And from the calculations that we received, for every $100,000 that we would raise through a stormwater management fee, it would cost the average homeowner $2. So that's something that we really want to make sure folks are thinking about when we're moving forward with this, is that instituting that kind of a fee would actually it would hurt a little less to raise a little more for the township to implement these projects, these programs. So again, if the township were to raise $1 million for infrastructure, that could be raised through increasing a property tax, which would be about a $40 hit on everybody, or it could be raised through a stormwater management fee, which would be about a $20 hit for a homeowner. Now, that's going to be a disproportionate, some people may say disproportionate hit on business owners, on commercial development. That's a conversation we need to have as a township, but again, this is about letting folks know what the choices are, what the options are for funding these kinds of initiatives. So I just want to kind of close with throwing that out there as just something to chew on as far as how we can implement some of these things. Again, the plan will be up for the next month on embracemillcreek.com. Feel free to check it out. And again, if you want a hard copy, stop by the Township building and ask for one. And again, thanks again. Really do appreciate it.